Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for being here. This is our 7th year in HILT, and just for those of you who don't know about our organization, we're a university-wide organization designed to seed innovation in teaching and learning and to convene people across our schools to share best practices about teaching and learning with one another. And the speaker series is one mechanism that we use to do the convening part of our work. We have designed this particular mechanism with the notion of having scholars, often in our community, but sometimes from the outside, come in and talk about their work and how it can improve teaching and learning. This is our 9th one of our speaker series. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Kathy to do this talk today. I think it might be the perfect alignment of all of the things that we've been thinking about with your background and what you're working on. So Kathy is faculty co-director of the Learning and Teaching program at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and she directs the DataWise project. She works with individuals and organizations to try to get them to work together to improve teaching and learning, especially using data and evidence. And I mean, that is exactly what we're trying to do too. Just by way of background, she did her undergraduate in economics at Yale and PhD in public policy here. And I think it's very interesting to imagine that particular educational trajectory and then getting you to the kind of work that you're doing now. I also wanted to mention that she's going to be featured in next Monday's Into Practice issue. Many of you will have seen Into Practice. If not, sign up for this electronic newsletter. We started meeting with Kathy over the summer, we being Melissa and I, and when we were initially thinking, okay, we want to feature Kathy in Into Practice, what are some of the ideas she might have about low investment ways to improve teaching and learning? And so she threw out a number of them, and then she said, well, I also do this MOOC thing, but I'd be lying if I said that was a low investment. And then she proceeded to say, but it was really worth it. And maybe it's going to be one of those investments in time that will save time later, and certainly has changed the way I think you've thought about your residential teaching and the way you do your residential teaching. And so that is how we ended up with the talk today. Interestingly, this brings together residential teaching and online teaching. And so we've been thinking of this speaker series as a partnership between us and HarvardX, and that we're doing this, we're offering this talk to our community together. And so I wanted to quickly introduce Sarah Grafman from HarvardX. She is the manager of instructional development at HarvardX and worked closely with Kathy on this project.
So very quickly, because I really want to get to the good stuff, more than 40 on-campus courses are currently using or have used HarvardX materials. That includes architectural imagination at the Graduate School of Design. You can ask my colleague Andrew over there if you have any questions about that. Causal diagrams at the Chan School of Public Health. Poetry is now a gen ed course, and of course, there's DataWise. If anyone has any questions about HarvardX, feel free to see me afterwards, or Mike Kahn in the back. And I actually just got back from 3 days. Erin mentioned I've worked on DataWise. I'm actually still working on it a little bit. Ongoing. I just got back from 3 days in Prince George's County, Maryland, where I was filming for DataWise. So this is just a wonderful capstone to my week. And without any further ado, Kathy, please come on up and talk to us.
Thank you, Erin, for that very wonderful introduction. I literally remember the day HILT was announced because I was like, at last, those are my people. And I appreciate that you have brought us together in so many different ways over the, I can't believe it's 7 years. But it's an honor to be able to talk to you about some work that grew out of the sort of the ethos that I feel like HILT is bringing to the school. And thank you, Sarah. Sarah has really been my right-hand woman for taking this bold step into online learning, which is something I had not done anything with prior. And also I just have to thank RT and Bill from the Teaching and Learning Lab at Harvard, because this is what you're going to hear about today is very much the work of many, a collaboration, because as Erin said, that's the way I like to work. And also to recognize Christina from the Harvard Education Press, because all of this content wouldn't have come to be if we didn't have a book that we felt we wanted to get more widely spread. So thank you, Christina, for being here. So our agenda for today is that we're going to start with some introductions, and then I'm going to just hit on a few things. Our goals, why we even did what we did, what it was that we did when we did what we did, some surprises that came along the way, and a chance for some reflections. And these are your insights, your worries, and your questions. So first I just want to get a sense of kind of who is in the room right now. So I know several of you, but could you just raise a hand if you're a faculty member? Wonderful. And could you just call out what departments or what schools you're at? Medical? Sociology?
Languages and anthropology.
What a great thing. Okay, so we've got quite a diversity there. What about students? Wonderful. And people who actually work on online learning sort of in a staff capacity in some way? Trying to decide, can you wear two hats, Liz? Let me hear from the folks who haven't raised their hands. Raise your hand so I know who you are. And just tell me about, well, I know who you are. Yeah, I know you. What are you involved in? Library, okay.
Slate at Kennedy School.
Yes, my alma mater. Bach Center, of course.
And space planning and physical resources.
Wow. That's really cool. I really care about that. And then over here, who do we have?
I'm from the library.
Library, and we have a library in the back as well, right? No? Yeah, right there in the red, yeah. Okay, all right, anyway, great to have you all here. So I would just like for you right now, we're gonna be using these sticky notes in a few ways. One is just write down on one the word why, and then your why for why you came here at 11 o'clock in mid-December on a beautiful day. Let's start with that. Okay, and then as you sort of finish your sentence, if you could just turn to one other person and share your whys with one another, and I'm going to come around and eavesdrop. So I thought I would start with my why, which is actually the why about me doing the work I do, because the things we're going to be talking about today in terms of like how to have online and residential courses, that's just sort of how you make it happen, but I'm animated by the reason why I get into this in the first place. And I'm going to be drawing on the golden circle that Simon Sinek put out in his TED Talk. Anybody familiar with Sinek, starting with why? I recommend it if you've got an extra 15 minutes. So the idea is people want to know why first. After that, you can tell them how, and then you tell them what. So that's the order in which I approach my work. So this guy's face kind of captures my why. So I believe that every single kid in the US and in the world deserves to be held to really high expectations for their learning. No matter what their background demography is, every single kid is worthy of that. And there's, in terms of from an educational standpoint, that means every kid should be able to have a really rich learning environment that allows them to sort of grow and develop. So that's my why. My how, I actually don't get to hang out with this guy. I'm looking at Sarah because she was down filming him when we first made the MOOC in Delaware several years ago. But we spent a lot more time talking to the folks that are sort of underlie this kid's learning and all kids' learning. What we have here is the 4th grade team at Leisure Elementary School. This is Principal Deirdre, assistant principal at the end, and these are the 4th grade teachers. And they are working together. Deirdre just sets aside her Thursday and boom, 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 meets with each grade level team to talk about the data from that grade level and how they're going to use it to improve instruction. And I believe that each one of those people also deserves to be held to really high expectations for what they can learn. Just because they became a teacher or a principal doesn't mean there's lots of room for improvement, and in particular, high expectations for how much they can learn about how to work with one another. And so that's sort of where a lot of my effort is spent. And then the how is data-wise, which is the word we give for the 8-step improvement model that was developed with faculty members, teachers, principals from the Boston Public Schools all got together right in the wake of No Child Left Behind, which was a piece of legislation that made it very imperative for people to test kids a lot. And we got people together to say, all right, if we're going to be doing all this testing, what would be the high road of that you could take to use that data to improve instruction without just trying to game the system or bump a couple kids up so that the school got out of trouble. So data-wise is our what. And if I had to sum it up in 6 words, it's about educators collaborating. So all, very big there, it's not just for some, all students thrive. And that's not all students get great test scores. We're talking about thriving as we would want for any of our kids. So I'm not going to spend much time on the what because you guys are here to hear more about the how, but I feel like in order to understand what we did, it's at least important to know that when we got that group of principals, faculty, teachers together, after 2 years, we figured out that what excellent teachers did was they went through a very deliberate process where they organized for collaborative work, made sure they had time and norms for really effective working together. They built literacy around the kinds of assessments that they were going to be using and didn't assume everybody knew how to interpret those tests just because they were working in the building. They created a data overview that sort of created a sense of urgency and showed people visually why there was a need to improve. And then instead of going, typically what a lot of schools were doing was going straight from that overview data to boom, we better reteach the 10 items people did poorly on and get straight to action. But the schools didn't do that. They went deeper. They didn't use that high stakes test data to figure out what was to answer the question of where kids were struggling. They used it as a jumping off point to really dig into student data, lots of different things, student work, conversations with students, understand what was a student learning issue that needed to be addressed. Then they turned the mirror on themselves, examined their own practice, and then they went to action. And so that slowing down of the process allows, first of all, to really pay attention to all kids. It also means bringing in all voices of faculty in the room to sort of be deliberately going through this process. Then you have an action plan. You plan how you're going to assess it, act and assess, and perhaps go around. So that's the thing that I'm trying to teach people. Does that make sense? All right. And the way that we shared this, first of all, was our book. So as Christina knows well, this book came out in 2005, and it has been, starting then, it became something that I was actually surprised at how quickly it gained traction, but it showed you how to go through each of those steps, a chapter per step. All right. So your task as we go from here on is to keep track, and I recommend you sort of take 3 stickies in front of yourselves and put a header on each one. So 1 sticky for insights that might come up as we're talking today. 1 for worries, because kind of some of the stuff we did was a little bit risky. And if you try to think about your why and what you're trying to get out of coming here, what that I'm saying kind of makes you nervous. And then your last sticky can be your questions. And we're going to have a chance to sort of share these in a little while. OK, so at the time that I first dipped my toes into online learning, it was only 2014. I feel like it's been a way of life for a while. But in 2014, what we had was this wonderful book. And we had a way to teach people how to launch that process that I just described in their settings. And we did it in 2 ways. I had a degree program course, which was a sort of a J-term module, intensive. I'd get a bunch of people into a big room at the ed school and figure out over the course of a week how to get them ready to bring this process to someone else. And then I had a professional ed course in June where we brought teachers and principals from around the world. They came together and they learned how to launch it. And we were actually quite satisfied with this particular world, except there were a couple of things that we wanted to do. So our one goal was we wanted to really deepen the way that DataWise was being taught. And so that week felt so short that I had people's attention for. And I thought, what if we could do more during that week? What if we could make sure that people really understood DataWise before they went out in the world and started to share it? And then the other thing I wanted to do was to and so as part of that is I wanted to be able to start those weeks with like hitting the ground running. I wanted to have students be invested and have done some pre-thinking about how what I was going to teach affected them. And I wanted to free time, class time for the deeper work. The other thing I wanted to do is I wanted to spread things out because I did the math and I realized that if I had about 50, 60 people in my January term class and then 100 plus in my summer class, that was going to be 160 people a year that I was reaching. And I thought, what if I empowered those 160 people after they had been in my care? What if they could then have something to share back in their setting? So that was my sense of spread. And also just the folks that can't come to Harvard or that we didn't have access, how could we create something that got them interested too? So the hope there was that I could equip my students to freely, because I didn't really want to be a big marketer for having them like, you gotta come to Harvard to take this class, easily, and then really important is this one, faithfully share, because I was getting a little afraid of a potential game of telephone that might be happening in the world, where I would describe what DataWise was, and then when somebody else went to describe it elsewhere, that maybe something would be lost. And I was really worried that the thing that would be lost was my why. Because it would be just an easy thing for people to say, oh, here's a way to do data because it's important to do data. And that is not compelling, right? I wanted to make sure people heard from me that the reason why we were looking at data is because it was going to let us shine a light on what kids were learning and not learning and figure out how to work together to address that. So I decided to jump in and make a MOOC with HarvardX. So here's a little screenshot from the MOOC. It was pretty quickly, we decided that it was so obvious we needed one module for each of those steps. So that was kind of like the organizing feature. And then I realized I really wanted it to be self-paced. At the time that we made our MOOC, it was a little bit less common to have a self-paced MOOC, but I thought, this is going to be busy teachers and grad students. I don't want to presume that I know exactly the pacing they want this content. And I knew I wanted it to be no more than 8 hours because I wanted them to get through the whole thing and not get kind of bogged down anywhere. So I was like, 8 hours, that's one crazy day, one Sunday in your pajamas, just take the MOOC and get it under your belt. Or that's, a couple of months of every Monday, maybe watching it with your faculty meeting group, just an hour together to get it through. And it seemed like that was the right size. And so that was one of our first thoughts was like, when we're talking about going online, what do we mean and what scale? And it was so liberating to realize that was my call. And I have never looked back from having it be a rather small piece. And another piece of that was the book has such richness. It's like 250 pages, all these details about how you would actually implement this. And I didn't want this to just be sort of something that could substitute for the book. I wanted it to be something that brought people in and made them just on fire to read all 250 pages. And I thought it would be super clear if this is just an 8-hour experience that those aren't substitutes for one another. So it's kind of like a reel them in kind of thing. So the structure of our 8 modules were, we would give people content about the step, then we would have them do a self-assessment, and then we would have them do some practice. From a content standpoint, they got to see sort of me and my animated swoosh, which is what we call that arrow, and I would explain what are all the key tasks at this particular step, and I would try to do so in as compelling a way as I could, making the sort of humdrum stuff seem excited. But what helped was right after that, they got into seeing an actual school doing the work. And so because we had filmed down at a school, they could sort of pair that, oh, what is this step about, with how does that look in a school setting? And then they would have self-assessments that they would do after watching those 2 videos to kind of test their understanding. Here's a picture of the ladder of inference, which is one of the mental models that's been enormously important in DataWise. And this kind of assessment I really like, because what they needed to do was take these statements and then say which rung of the ladder they were on. It was kind of like a drag and drop sort of thing, just to try to get people to have one of our most important mental models be something they already knew when I first met them in class. The other thing that they needed to do is a self-assessment. And so the self-assessment was actually based on an activity that had been what I thought wildly successful in my in-person courses, where I would pass out a handout that looks like this, and I would give everybody all these colored dots. And in sort of great detail, I would go through each of the DataWise steps. It only took like 50 minutes. And people were putting stickers to say whether it was happening or not happening in their setting. Then they would get up, they'd go talk to other people, share their dots, and it kind of got people to realize, wow, some of this stuff we're already doing, so we've got strengths we can build on. And now I understand why we're not making progress, because there's spots along this arrow, and it was always different for different people, where we're kind of dead in the water. So that in-person activity, I wanted to have to somehow mimic that in the online space. So what we ended up doing, with enormous help from our teaching and learning lab and HarvardX folks, was to give a self-assessment that in the end ended up sort of, when you finished your 8-hour course, you had this lit up swoosh that showed you where you were with the steps. And what was nice, and I hadn't expected with the MOOC, is I didn't make people put 32 different stickers down, because that seemed like overkill. So we did 1 per step. But within, say, step 1, there's a lot of things you need to do. And they were able to be very specific about which of those they're doing and not doing, which allowed us to have, orange and things that didn't exist in my in-person piece. But what was fabulous about this is I required the 8-hour course for my residential students, like, get it done, show up with a printout of your arrow, or some of them had it on their phones or whatever, and be ready to go, which meant that the whole morning of my first class was sort of done for me when we showed up. And they were walking around looking at each other's arrows, which were much more nuanced than the paper ones I had used. And before we'd even hit lunchtime, people were talking about how what we were about to learn that week connected to them. And I feel like that got a level of investment in our group that was particularly powerful. From a practice standpoint, there's a lot of things that we do in DataWise that get people to really hold themselves back from making inferences that aren't supported by evidence. And so one of the things we do is try to get people used to saying some incredibly obvious things about what they see in a piece of student work or in a chart. And that took a lot of class time in the way I used to teach. What we did in the MOOC was we gave people, for each of the steps, we gave them something. So an essay about an elephant, perhaps, was what we did at step 4, dig into student data. And the people needed to read it, come up with what they noticed and then wondered, and then they got to watch our team doing a protocol where we were noticing and wondering about the same data, and then have sort of an online discussion about how did what they saw differ from what we saw, and what did they notice about the way that our team interacted with one another. And so again, that was another thing that I actually had people practice doing that in my setting, but I had never had a fishbowl and showed people what a sort of, I call it like a low inference conversation would look like. And this meant people got to show up in my class already knowing what I meant about that. So So that was very much around trying to deepen so that the people who came to my class would have a really good sense of what the process was and why it mattered to them before we even got started. What's been wonderful is I freed up hours that now I can use for whatever I want. And one of the biggest important pieces that we're using that time for is helping people to understand their why behind why they do this work, and understand how to communicate to others the importance of pursuing equity in the educational context. And that had been kind of a nice to have that I wished I could have done more of, and instead that much more nuanced conversation can happen in person with all the folks that are with us. But in terms of spread, I want to talk a little bit about what happened with equipping students. So this is what happened is that people did end up sharing this with their settings. Of course, HarvardX did an amazing job of trumpeting that the course existed. So very quickly, I realized that we were going way beyond my residential numbers. So that's around the US. Around the world, we've had 20,000 enrolled. So the spread is way beyond what my 160 times however many years was going to be. And lots of different countries represented. I would say outside of English-speaking countries, we've got a lot of Spanish-speaking countries as well, and Brazil. So that's sort of given me a sense of, wow, this content is now out there. And we've also been able to think about how does the MOOC sort of fit into what used to be sort of the data-wise world here of like, we've got these 2 courses and we've got a book. So what we're able to do is to back up from our launching and have an opportunity for people to explore what DataWise is about and to self-assess. And that's sort of the MOOC. It sort of gave this pre-thing. But it also enabled me to go beyond where I had been. So we also have a course now in my professional ed for integrating DataWise, which is because I now feel comfortable that when people go back to their settings, they've got sort of like, from the horse's mouth what DataWise is about, and they can share it. We have a 4-month course where we have virtual coaches to help people to actually integrate DataWise in their setting. And then in order to do that, we needed to develop a coaching cadre. So we now have certified DataWise coaches that definitely spend some time with me on campus, but they become people who are either coaching DataWise in their settings or they're helping with the online coaching that happens. And so we have a coach module for degree program students who want to become coaches or for certification people. And now we've got a network. And so we have a research practicum course that basically reaches back out to the people who are doing this in the field and has our doctoral students sort of studying them and figuring out how do we feed back how this is being received in the world into what we're doing. And then the people can be in a DataWise coach network who take our more elaborate courses. So I don't want to, it's not actually the case that if you make a MOOC, all this will happen. So I don't want you to think that that's what I'm trying to say, but it made the possibility so real because we knew there was a way to get this in the hands of lots of people. So I'm going to tell you about a couple of surprises and then let you guys sort of think how this is landing for you. One thing was, there was this word that HarvardX was saying a lot, and I think Hilt was talking a lot about repurposing of assets. I know TLL was talking about it at Ed School, but it's been really interesting to me how I can use this in different places. So I built it as 8 hours before they even show up. But now in other classes that I'm teaching, or if I'm teaching, say, a 3-hour workshop either here or somewhere else, I can click into any one of these videos. So I just made a kind of a cheat sheet for myself. And if I want to just show what is looking at examining your own practice at the Delaware School look like, I can click into that and I've got a 5-minute video that I can share with a large audience and explain what I mean. So that's been really useful to have those little pieces. The version 3.0, I didn't know that we were going to be able to continuously improve a course on continuous improvement, but we have. As Sarah mentioned, I was all excited that we were able to show what it looked like when this was happening in a school. Sarah was down finding out what does it look like if this happens in a district of 208 schools. And so now we've got that added to the MOOC as for people who have more of a system level hat on. Discussion forum blues. I want to say that I pictured there would be more rich back and forth conversations among people on the platform than there were. And I think that I would say that the actual platform hasn't caught up with our imaginations about how we could get people to interact in a self-paced course across space and time. But I'm hoping there'll be a version 4.0 where that can happen. And then I also was sort of surprised in some way pleasantly, in some way not, about the book MOOC trade-off. So the pleasant thing is, just checked in with Christina, and she says that this has not cannibalized sales of our book. Book sales are still super strong. The less pleasant thing is, in my course evals, I sometimes have students saying, it seemed like you made us take the whole MOOC and then you made us read the whole book, and that was sort of a lot. And I worry because they say, I think just the MOOC would have been enough. And that was my fear, was that this would turn into some watered down data-wise, where in 8 hours people could think they were doing it. So that's kind of a thing that I've got to think about, and I wonder if that's a concern for some of you, about when you put your information out there, are people going to want sort of like this 21st century Twitter-sized version of what you're doing? But mercifully, the book sales are still holding strong. So I don't know if people have had a chance. Yes, nicely done. I see there's been some writing of insights, worries, and questions. I'm going to give you sort of just 2 minutes of silent think time to sort of look through your worries and stuff, and then give you a chance to sort of get up at the boards in small groups and kind of talk about that. So 2 minutes to just figure out what you're going to want to hash out about what you just heard. This activity is just very data-wise to have people sort of up and at it and having conversations around materials. So I appreciate you testing that out. What it does is it guarantees that I know there's questions in the room now, right? So I would love to hear from folks. Oh, hi. What is on your mind?
Just have a fairly basic question about data-wise and less about MOOC book course. To what extent is your data-wise model used and focused primarily on K-12 versus higher ed? And if there are higher ed uses, what are they? That may be off topic for this particular session. So
okay, I'll give a short answer to that, and we can talk more after. So yes, so higher ed is also, there's nothing about those 8 steps that makes it have to be K-12. We started it with K-12, but the take-up we're having is among especially teacher preparation programs that want to know how to get better at teaching their educators, because they're sort of in this particular world. But even within the Harvard Graduate School of Education, there's certain pockets of things where we're kind of taking this 8-step approach to our work. So let's talk more about what you might have in mind. But the process is very generic, as you can see, so it's easy to apply. With the microphone, please.
Well, I'm just curious about, because your project seems to be about assessment. So how do you assess the people who take the book course, whether they actually faithfully implement the principles or the approach that you advocate?
So whether they implement it in their own schools and settings?
Right. So for example, do they need to submit something to you so you can interpret? Or basically, I'm just wondering, how do you make sure that your message or the approach got implemented faithfully?
I don't. I don't, and I feel like I have to put that out there. If you're going to do an 8-hour introduction course, the thing I can assess for, which I do, is, do you understand, are people understanding the importance of making low inference observations, and are they capable of distinguishing between a low inference and a high inference statement? That I can assess for. I can assess for, are they able to see a team and understand the particular moves that people within the group are making to make sure all voices get heard. Those kind of things I can assess for, but I have no idea how people are doing in the world. And the thing that makes me feel okay about that is, when I was only selling books, I had no idea what people were doing with the books either. So you do have to be at peace that it's like, that it's part of what you do, but that sort of elaborate set of courses, when we're at the level of when I'm certifying a coach, oh yeah, they submit a 30-page report that explains how did they do it in their setting, what did they do. But for a MOOC, it's light. Yes, back. Just grab the microphone, yeah.
My question is about how long it took you to create this. The videos, you had the equipment. What was the process for that?
I mean, I just have to take a moment to just say HarvardX was extraordinary to work with. Like something like equipment, I don't know. Something like, what's the filming schedule that's happening in Delaware? Like, I went down and did a scouting to sort of figure out what's the story we needed to tell, and then Sarah and her team went down and actually made it happen on site. So Sarah, from the very beginning that we started, we had a few ideas. I think in like, was it 12 months total to get the first one out?
That sounds about right. I
Maybe,
feel like we
maybe
started
18 if we start with ideas.
Yeah, 12 to 18. I'm trying to think when we first met. Early 2014, and we launched in spring of 2015. No. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
So
it was a little bit over a year.
Yeah.
And there were moments where it took an unbelievable amount of my time. So I'm just going to tell you that. Like when I had to, so for a 5-minute video, I would be in the studio for like 2 hours getting the 5 minutes that I had to say. And just because of the way I'm oriented, I wanted to see like the rough cut of the video and have something to say about how things were done. I wanted to talk about like what were going to be the racial backgrounds of the people that the artist drew to have doing data-wise when I was talking about it. You know what I mean? So part of it has to do with how involved you want to be in the work, but there are moments where it felt like it was a lot.
This was very inspiring. I'm in the process of preparing a new course, which is a service learning course here at Harvard. And I'm working on a short pre-recording lectures, which I'm doing very simply over Canvas, just to save some time, as you do as well. My question to you is, if you were in my role, is there anything that you could advise me to think about as I'm running my course for the first time, if I would in the future like to prepare it into the MOOC? So I am thinking about the pre-recorded lectures. I'm hoping that maybe part of the class activity could be recorded as well, because it's going to be very engaging students with their own roles and presentations, so that I could create something like you did, the case studies.
Yes.
So I'm just asking you, is there anything else that you think that I should have in mind if in the future I would like to turn this course into a MOOC? As I'm for the first time running the course, is there other things that I can already set the wheels in motion that would help me later on in the way?
Yeah, I would say that the two things that leap to mind are sort of paying attention to what are the deep understandings that you want people to have, and being clear about what you think could be conveyed, not necessarily through experience. So I feel like trying at the beginning of this course to figure out what those are, and then looking back and figuring out that's what they were. But then the other thing I would say is think about what are your most successful in-person experiences and what makes them successful. So at first when I started talking about this, I'm like, well, we're not going to be able to do my favorite stoplight protocol. That's not going to work online. Or I don't know how we're going to get people to understand the ladder of inference, because I need that to be a very kind of physical thing. And it's amazing if you've got a great instructional designer working with you, and if you can talk about what do you do that's crazy successful in your class that gets people, either excited or really engaged. A great instructional designer will help you kind of pull out how to make that more virtual. So don't fear that you have to give it all up.
You were talking about having the PhD student to go back to the settings and do assessment and give feedback. My question is, how do we make sure, like, we give timely feedback when the teachers or implementers have like questions that need to be addressed like in a short time, what do we do? Or do they approach you?
So it's interesting, the settings where people are going, where I'm sending my doctoral students to either virtually or in person, see what's happening someplace, those are places that went way beyond the MOOC. So they're places that started with the MOOC, but then sent a team of teachers up here and then took a 4-month virtual course. And it was in that 4-month virtual course that most of the feedback happened. And so what was really important was to standardize the format in which they told their stories of what was happening in the field. So we have this thing that's, we call it a data-wise journey, but essentially it's a PowerPoint deck that has sort of that swoosh arrow, and then for step 1 it says, what did you do? What's the evidence of what happened? What do you reflect on it? And we have our virtual TFs, they're looking through those journeys and providing feedback as each step unfolds about what did you do, what did the evidence and how it goes. So because otherwise it was just too overwhelming to think like, we're trying to improve in our 2,000 kid high school, and are we doing a good job? Like, I don't know. So there, you have to sort of put it on the site to give you information in a way that your trained people are prepared to give the feedback that'll move them along. But so to me, that's very much a question about my 4-month online course, which people do have to pay for, has a much different model in terms of the feedback, but it draws on the MOOC. It couldn't actually happen if we didn't have the MOOC, because I need all that content somewhere, and then I could really use brain space to think about, and then what does our feedback model look like when people are willing and able to pay to receive that feedback from our team. Yeah.
I feel like I'm at the Oscars every time I hold one of these. So I love the breadth you were talking about, scale and people bringing back the learning to their communities and sharing out the experience via the MOOC to some degree. Do you qualify that sort of additional sort of ring of attendees, if you will? So people who have not attended on campus or participated explicitly in an enrollment for a non-site course, but those people who go back to their districts and share it out with people, is there something as just sort of functional as the login having to be an EDU address, or having, I guess that would make sense in K through 12, but whatever the equivalent is. So
you mean, do I restrict who can take the MOOC?
Yes, is there any gatekeeping, especially even since you have a forum, in terms of managing that community? So one of the ways to do that is by having a requirement for signing up. You must be an administrator, or you must be, a K through 12 teacher.
No, we don't, and we made it's just anybody who wants to take it. We do have sort of light facilitation where if somebody were saying something really offensive, that would be caught, right? So that's not happening, but it was really important to keep it wide. And what was interesting was I sort of thought we made it for educators, but you hear people who work in all levels of different kinds of government that might just want to know how to look at data better. The international participation has been fascinating, like to see who is drawn to the course. And I think if I had any gatekeeping on it, I might be keeping people out who seem to be getting a lot out of it. We're at noon, Erin.
We're at noon. It's on? Yeah. I can't believe how much you packed in this hour. That was really impressive to me. And I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank Kathy. You guys helped me.
Thank you.